Thank you very much, Sam. Good afternoon. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Terrific. I cannot believe the number of people in this room. I'm almost overwhelmed. It just proves the tremendous interest in Holocaust these days. And I'm not surprised because we live in a very turbulent time. And I welcome the opportunity to share my experiences from the camp. And I want to start off by going back a few years. I was talking to a middle school class. One of the students came up and asked me afterwards, do you feel guilty or lucky being alive? First of all, for an 8th grader, I thought that was a very perceptive question. And yes, I feel very lucky because I was in a camp with 15,000 children. Less than 1,200, less than 10% survived, and I was one of them. So I'm able to relate my experiences. In many ways, I feel that I'm representing the 6 million Jews that lost their lives due to the atrocities committed by Hitler. They're not able to talk to you today, but I am very pleased to be able to do it on their behalf. Unfortunately, more and more people are forgetting about the Holocaust. There are even people that are denying that it ever took place. I can never understand how anybody can deny that it took place. There's an increase in anti-Semitism, there's an increase in vandalism of Jewish property. So as far as I'm concerned, and I realize I'm not totally objective, it's more important than ever that we always remember the Holocaust. And whenever I speak, whether it's to a library or school, I ask each person, please relate the message. Yes, there was a Holocaust. Talk to 4 people. Be my ambassador. And you know for sure because you had an opportunity to listen to an eyewitness. If I may have the first slide. Thank you. This shows the cover of my book. The book was updated and expanded in 2018. And if anybody's interested in purchasing, I have copies available. They're only $15, and we'll do that afterwards. A Danish boy in Theresienstadt. There's only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure that people, especially future generations, will always remember that the Holocaust took place. On the next slide, I'm showing a map of Denmark. And I'm always curious, are there any Danes by any chance in the audience? Okay. Anybody been to Denmark in the audience? Okay. Quite a few. Did you go to Copenhagen? Did you have a chance to visit my hometown, my favorite town, Odense? It's in the middle of the country. But I'm glad you visited. I want to talk about a very bad event that took place in Denmark 85 years ago. To be more exact, April the 9th, 1940. Hitler and the Nazis invaded Denmark by land, by sea, and by air. There wasn't much of a battle going on. Denmark had to surrender after a few hours for one simple reason. The country was not prepared because we had signed a non-aggression pact with the Germans. But we learned very early on that we couldn't trust the man, the evil man, Hitler, and they occupied the country for the next 5 years. I was barely 5 years old at the time, but I can still see the German soldiers marching up and down the street. And what I am more surprised at than anything else is the fact that conditions in Denmark were almost, and I want to emphasize the word almost, normal the first 3 years. In other countries, there were 20 countries occupied by the Nazis. All of them, the government was taken over by the Nazis. But in Denmark, the government continued to govern. The king continued to rule. And this was most unusual. And I think Hitler wanted to show that they could occupy a country, and at the same time, the country could continue to operate. There are a number of reasons why this happened. Denmark, to some extent, tried to cooperate with the Germans. And another reason is the food. Denmark produced a number of agricultural products. We used to ship them over to Great Britain. Now Hitler ordered us to ship them down to Germany. We fed part of the country in Germany, and we fed the troops, the German troops in Denmark. Apparently they liked the food very much, because I read a book not too long ago, and one of the soldiers mentioned in the book they just loved Denmark because of the Danish food. I want to emphasize that this was a very, very unique situation. And as I mentioned earlier, Hitler occupied 20 countries in Europe. I talked about the Danish king. On the next slide, you see a picture of the king, Christian X, riding on his horse. He would do that every morning to support the Danish people. He was in his early 70s. He remained behind. Most of the royalty in Europe fled to England or even as far away as Canada, but he stayed behind. On the next picture, if any of you recognize this young fellow, I guess I haven't changed as much as I thought. But there's much more important reason for sharing the picture with you. When I look back, this picture was actually taken in the summer of 1943, a few months before we were arrested. And it's hard to imagine that Denmark was occupied. There were literally German soldiers on every street corner. I saw them every day when I would bicycle to and from school. They never touched me. They never talked to me. I couldn't speak German. They couldn't speak Danish. But to be on vacation under those circumstances, it surprises me greatly. Can we go back to the map, please? Thank you. Things changed dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. Young people formed groups, sabotage groups, in just about every single town you see on the map. Small groups, young people, mostly students. I was reading a book about it not too long ago, and there were two young high school students, part of the Churchill group, which was one of the more famous groups. Their objective was to prevent products to reach Germany, especially food, but Hitler also made us manufacture other products for the Germans to be shipped down to Germany, and their objective was the same: we don't want to ship it down. It's amazing how well they did in sabotaging the Germans. They sunk the Danish fleet so that Germany couldn't get hold of it. They sabotaged rails, factories. It was a very, very courageous move because their life was in danger. Some of them lost their lives, some of them ended up in prison. But anyway, this was too much for the German commandant in Denmark, and he went to the Danish government, talked to the government, gave them an ultimatum: you have to arrest all the young people, and you have to sentence them to death. That was enough for the Danish government. They resigned, and that was in late August 1943, and that was the beginning of the final solution or the roundup of Jewish people. Again, conditions were different in Denmark. There was a German diplomat with close ties, Duckbridge his name was, with close ties to Danes. He heard that it was leaked out that Denmark was, they were going to start arresting the Jewish people. In Copenhagen, the capital of the country, as you can see, the northeastern part, most of the Jewish people lived in that town, or around it. I would say about 90% of the Jewish population in Denmark. At that time, there were about 7,500 Jewish people in Denmark, a relatively small percentage compared to many other countries in Europe. Word got around very fast, starting in the synagogue in Copenhagen. The rabbi told the members, "You better get out of here, you're going to be arrested on October the 2nd. Following, there were a number of families, non-Jewish families, in and around Copenhagen that helped hide the Jewish people. They were hiding in their homes, they were hiding in the hospital, and they were hiding in churches. As a matter of fact, a cousin of mine was hiding in the loft just north of Copenhagen. As a result, and this was unheard of, and to my knowledge it didn't happen in any other country, 95% of the Jewish population managed to escape to Sweden. Sweden was a neutral country, and they were good enough to open the borders not only for Danish Jews, but also for Norwegian Jews. Unfortunately, we were among the 5% that didn't manage to get to Sweden. To my knowledge, we had not been alerted. We lived in the middle of the country. You can see in the red frame the town marked Odense. And as I said earlier, by far a big percentage of the Jewish people lived in and around Copenhagen. So one early morning, it was October the 2nd, it was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, and the Germans thought they had planned it very well, because they figured all the families would be home celebrating their holiday. When they got to most of the doors, the Jewish people had left. We were arrested. We got about 40 or 50 minutes to get ready, packed our suitcases. My mother and I were allowed to go down to the bakery. The bakery was on the ground floor in the building where we lived. We knew the baker. I played with his children. The baker gave us some bread and rolls. And I heard afterwards, he even offered to help my mother and I escape, which might have been possible through the corridor in the basement. There was no way my mother could accept that. My father, back in the apartment, would have been shot on the spot. If you can go forward a couple of slides. Next one, thank you. You see the truck in the picture? To my knowledge, this is the only picture taken of the arrest of the Jewish people in Denmark. This was in the school in the middle of my hometown, Odense, and we were trucked there from our home, assembled in the schoolyard for a couple of hours. There were about 60 people there. A number of times I looked with magnifying glass on the picture, trying to see if I could find my family there, but I cannot. On the next picture, we were transported to the west coast of Denmark. And can you imagine spending over 3 days and 3 nights in the cattle car, very similar to the one you see in that picture? It was completely dark. no windows, there was one door, it was locked from the outside, no food, nothing to drink. There were 3 children about my age, I was 8 years old. We were able to lie down, but the rest of the people, because there was very little room, had to alternate between standing and sitting for over 3 days and over 3 nights. I described the atmosphere as being very, very tense. I can still see the frightened faces of many of the inmates in the cattle car. Fortunately, some of us had brought bakery products, sandwiches, snacks, and we shared it with everybody in the cattle car. I heard later on in another cattle car, there was a woman that committed suicide rather than going to the concentration camp. The smell was getting worse and worse. There were no bathroom facilities. We had to use buckets in the corner of the cattle car. We made one stop, got some fresh air, got some water to drink, and the worst part was probably that we had no idea where we would go. Would they shoot us? Where would we end up? Eventually we found out, as you'll see on the next slide, we ended up in Tersen. Tersen is the Czech version of the camp, the town. Theresienstadt would be the German version. It's about 550 miles south of Denmark. It's about 40 miles north of Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic as it's called today. On the next map, you see the train station on the left. Thank you. Train station on the left. People, Jewish people walking from the train station into the camp. At that time, we didn't have a train station in the camp, and we had to walk for about a mile or a mile and a half. So what happened when we entered the camp? The Germans ordered us to empty our pockets. They took all our valuables. They took our money, even though my father told me later on that when we were arrested, and I assume when other Jewish people were arrested, they encouraged my father to bring money. They went through our suitcases, took some of the good clothing, and certainly any valuables they could find. Then we were split up in groups, women, men, children. At that time, you were considered a child until you were 15 years old. 16, you were an adult. One of the worst experiences I remember from the time in camp took place on November 11, was 1943. In the middle of the night, it was pitch black, and we slept in barracks. The Germans woke us up screaming. I didn't understand any German, as I said earlier, but I learned very fast the word snell, snell, fast, fast. I use that all the time. Get out of here. There was a roll call. We ended up in a field, a very muddy field. It was raining. We spent 12 hours while they counted us in pouring rain. There were people that were literally dying on the spot. There were people that fainted, got nothing to drink, nothing to eat during those 12 hours. And we were all warned not to touch the people that had fainted or died, or you'll be sent to an extermination camp. Eventually, we came back to camp, but that was an occasion I'll never forget. On the next slide, this is an illustration of a loft, very similar to where my mother spent time in the camp, 18 months, my father in separate barracks. And the more I think about it, the more surprised I am that my mother was able to talk to the authorities and persuade them that I could stay with her. I stayed with her for the entire 18 months, and I think that helped me a great deal. It was very hot in the summer. I remember waking up, scratching myself. My mother had to explain to her 8-year son about lice, fleas, and bed bugs. I'd never heard about it. You can see we slept in bed bugs, and as I mentioned earlier, if you were 16 years or older, you were an adult, you were considered an adult, and you had to perform slave labor. And that included my father. He was an attorney. He was used to working in an office, litigating in the courthouse, and suddenly he was assigned and had no choice. He was assigned work, very heavy road work, long days, long weeks, no holidays, no weekends off. It was very difficult for him to keep up because he wasn't used to that kind of work. He did his best, but it was difficult. Word got back to us much later from a young man who worked in the same group as my father, and he told us how difficult it was for him. But he also told us that my father had been physically abused. He was kicked and whipped when he didn't perform up to the standards arbitrarily set by the Germans. To my knowledge, I forgot something very important. My father lost, according to my mother, about 50% of his body weight. He ended up in infirmary. They had competent doctors and nurses, but they didn't have the supplies or the medicine to help him. And he passed away at the young age of 40, having been married to my mother for less than 10 years. He clearly died from hunger. But of course the Germans were not going to broadcast to the world that anybody died from hunger. And on the death certificate it said that my father died from pneumonia. To my knowledge, my mother was not physically abused like my father, but she worked also long hours, had different jobs. She worked in a factory, worked with a mineral called mica. It was used as insulation material for the German planes. They worked in a factory. There were about 200 or 300 women on the floor. One day, close to the finish, an officer came in, asked the different inmates how they were feeling, how they were doing. When he got to my mother, she answered, "Not very well, I lost my husband." "How did you lose your husband?" My mother said very innocently, "He died from hunger." Of course, the officer didn't like that remark, and he wanted to intimidate the entire group, and he came back 8 consecutive days and asked my mother the same question, and now she answered, my husband died from pneumonia. As a matter of fact, she told me later on that the co-workers on the floor couldn't believe what my mother had answered originally and said she could have been shot. I was 8 years old and I didn't have to work. I did some voluntary work. Not much you can do at that age. I was a messenger, I was a gopher, and I would go from one German office to the other and pick up messages, pick up documents, giving them to other officers. Those soldiers, I still can see them. I was afraid of them. They looked very intimidating. They never touched me, as I mentioned earlier. But you never know what might happen. I always refer to them as soldiers in the ugly green uniforms, and then of course they had their guns. So on my way back one day from working, and I worked a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon, and on my way back I passed the kitchen, and at the end of the kitchen I saw some big sacks of raw potatoes. I looked around to make sure nobody was watching, took a couple of raw potatoes, put them in my pocket, and took them back, and my mother and I ate the raw potatoes. Yes, I shouldn't have done it, but we needed all the help we could get. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget when I told the story to school several years ago, one of the students called me the potato king. But anyway, I want to talk to you about food. Unfortunately, it's not going to take me very long. At breakfast we got substitute coffee, about half a loaf of bread to share with the whole family, and margarines. On the next slide you'll see us lining up. I refer to it as the soup kitchen. We line up for about 40 or 50 minutes. They serve potato soup day in and day out, 365 days a week, a year. How they had the nerve to call it potato soup, I can never understand. It consisted of potato peels and skin in hot water. I didn't eat it the first few days, but my mother said, Steen, you better eat it or you're not going to make it. We lined up for dinner as well. At least at dinner we got many different kinds of soup. I remember beef barley. About once a week we would get a special treat, a pasta dish. How were we able to survive on those meager portions? 140,000 people passed through the camp. 35,000 passed away, similar to my father, from hunger. I believe the only reason I'm here today to share my experiences in camp is the fact we started getting packages. All nations got packages from their home country. There were probably more Czech inmates in the camp than from anybody else. The packages that we got from Denmark and Sweden, arranged by the Red Cross, consisted of vitamins, clothing, and first of all, food. One day, my mother got a package. It was very heavy. Couldn't understand why it was so heavy until she opened it. No food, no clothing, no vitamins. One of the guards had taken all the good stuff and replaced it with a couple of bricks and put that back. How anybody can treat another human being that way, I can never understand. I want to give you another example from our time in camp. I was growing, I was now 9 years old, outgrown my shoes. Where was my mother going to buy shoes? No stores. So she bartered with a Czech lady. The Czech lady got some Danish food. My mother got some used shoes that fitted me, and I was able to use the shoes the rest of the time I spent in camp. I didn't realize it at the time, but later on I learned that food was very valuable. It was almost like gold. You could get, I was told you could get just about anything if you had food. I'm often asked, what did I do when I didn't line up for food, when I didn't work in the morning, afternoon? I played with other children, Danish children, Dutch children, but especially some Czech boys. We played soccer. We had a good time. This was probably the only time that I felt almost, with emphasis on the word almost, like a 9-year-old boy should. Enjoying life with the children, the boys, enjoying playing soccer. Yes, we didn't have a real soccer ball. The mothers had tied together some clothes, but we were able to communicate. I learned the Czech language phonetically, and it went very well. So one day, the children didn't show up. And I didn't learn until much later what had happened to them. On the next slide, I'm showing a transport. The cattle cars up there ended up in extermination camps like Birkenau, Auschwitz. 85,000 inmates from the camp ended up in the extermination camps. Very few of them survived. Most of them ended up in gas chambers. And as I found out later on, the children, the boys, I never saw them again. I just looked at my watch, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions and answers. So at least for the time being, I'm going to skip the next 2 slides and the next one, and go to this slide, which I refer to as happiness returns. After spending 18 months with uncertainty, would we be sent in transport? Would we get enough to eat? Would they shoot us? Or what would happen to us? We were saved. We were liberated by the Swedish Red Cross buses. You can see the Swedish flag on the side and the Red Cross logo. Again, Sweden was a neutral country. It was a miracle that they were allowed to save us. It's my understanding that they saved about 17,000 Jews from many different camps. There were 472 Jews that ended up in Theresienstadt. There were 425 that had survived, and we all ended up in the buses. It was hard to believe. As a matter of fact, we were able to save some Czech young ladies at the end. Our rabbi had phantom marriage, so they married some of the young guys, and that way they were able to get out of the camp. It was a miracle that they were able to drive through many countries to get to us. It was equally a miracle that we were able to return. I remember we had to stop many times. There was heavy bombardment, and I remember looking out and seeing a lot of young soldiers. I guess the adults had lost their lives, and there were literally teenagers that were marching up and down. On the next slide, we have arrived in Denmark, just past the border. I cannot believe the number of people that's shown here. I still remember it, but I had forgotten until I saw the picture. They welcomed us back with open arms, gave us flowers, gave us candy, snacks, sandwiches, and so on. And I was surprised that they were able to do that because the country was still occupied. Anyway, we were not allowed to stay in Denmark. We went to Sweden. We were in quarantine in Sweden for 8 to 10 days. They wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illnesses into the country. After 8 to 10 days, we reconnected with my family, and the whole family lived in Copenhagen, and the only one that lost his life was my father. And this is most unusual. If you talk or if you hear other survivors speak, they will say that they lost most of their family. 2 or 3 weeks later, on May the 5th, 1945, I'm showing a flag as the next slide, a Danish flag. It was flying everywhere in Denmark. The Germans had finally surrendered after 5 long years. The Danes celebrated as never before, and they probably used the Danish flag more than anybody else. I also celebrated the day for another reason. May the 5th, 1945 was my birthday, and I was 10 years old. And I remember not only on that May the 5th, but other May the 5th following, I would tell anybody who would listen, you know why they're flying the flag today? My brother. We could not return. We returned later on, late during the month of May, early June. Returned to our hometown. Our apartment had been rented out. We had nowhere to stay. Fortunately, our belongings had been stored by the legal company where my father worked. I'm often asked, what kind of welcome did we get? Couldn't ask for a better welcome. They couldn't do enough for us, our friends. Some good friends of my parents took us in. We lived there for several weeks. They helped us getting clothes, they helped us getting food. Eventually, my mother got an apartment, a smaller apartment. But at that time, it was very, very difficult to get apartments. In Theresienstadt, like any camp, there was no official schooling. We unofficially had some private lessons from teachers and other people in the camp. When I got back to my old school, a nice teacher gave me some private lessons. And I was very fortunate that I could go back to the class that I belonged to, which was 5th grade, even though I missed 4th and part of 3rd grade. And I didn't realize it, but I'm sure I was tested by the teacher with the private lesson to see if I could get into the 5th grade. I think that helped me a great deal in transformation from the terrible time in camp to my home life, being back with my old friends. And again, they were very helpful. I had a feeling that either my mother or maybe the principal of the school told them, don't ask any questions, because I don't remember many questions asked what happened in camp. As a matter of fact, it's very common, and that goes for my mother and I as well. And we don't talk about it, at the past. We try to look to the future. It's common, not only for survivors, but liberators, not to talk about it. So some years later, I graduated from high school. Then I graduated from commercial college in Copenhagen. Living in a small country, I wanted to go abroad, and I joined a Danish company that did most of their business outside of Denmark. I had some special training in Denmark, then off to England, then Canada, and eventually United States. I enjoyed my time very, very much with the company, and gave me a chance to see part of the world. I continued to work for the Danish company for several years, but then I joined some American companies. I wanted a challenge to see how I could manage, and I worked for McCormick Company, among others, and Kraft, and Sara Lee. I stayed in the United. I worked in the United States until 1999. I was almost 65 years old. I thought it was time to retire. And some years after I retired, I started writing my book. And when I finished writing the book, I thought it was all finished. I wasn't going to do anything else about the Holocaust. But then I was invited to my daughter's son's school, middle school in Park Ridge. As a matter of fact, one of the teachers is back there from the Park Ridge area. This But anyway, I I was very hesitant because I had talked to business group, but I never talked to students. And I didn't know how they would behave. Would they use their phone? Would they talk to each other? It was amazing the way they behaved. And this also been my experience with other schools. They thought it went quite well. And as a matter of fact, later on, my grandson's good friend told him that your grandpa was awesome. And when I heard that remark, I guess it was time to change career. And I started a new career in education. And that was in 2012, just after the book had come out. Hasn't just been my mission, but it's been my passion ever since. And this is why I'm so pleased to see practically a full house here, because it's important that we pass the word out to the newer generations. So I've spoken to schools and other venues since then, and I'm very lucky I kept track, and I exceeded 130,000 people the other day, and spoken about 900 times. And I set a goal many years ago to reach 100,000. I don't know what my new goal is going to be. It probably depends on my health, but I hope I can continue as long as possible. I want to finish with a little bit of humor because this is a very solemn subject. And it was an experience I had also with an 8th grade student some years ago. And after he had heard a presentation very similar to today, he came up to me and asked, did you do any dating in camp? He knew what my age was when I was in camp. And I said, no, at 8 years old, I didn't do anything. I'll finish here. I think you heard enough from me.
So at this point, Steen will be here with his daughter, Annalisa. And you are welcome to purchase the book directly from him and have a few words. Please join me in thanking him